Hey there, welcome back. Tonight we're going to take a journey into what it was really like to be a woman accused of crime in medieval Europe. Not a noble woman or a queen, but someone like you or me. Someone ordinary. Someone who may have done something small, or something society didn't like at all. Some of these stories are odd, some are heartbreaking, others are strangely mundane, but they're all true, or as close to truth as the medieval records can carry us. And before we begin, don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy winding down with quiet, strange histories like this, and leave a comment below letting me know where you're listening from, and what time it is right now where you are. Let's begin at the very bottom, not of a dungeon or a pit, or a prison, but something softer, something far quieter. The kinds of things that wouldn't seem criminal at all today, but in the medieval world, these were the first steps toward disgrace, punishment, or worse. I want you to imagine yourself living in a little village. Nothing grand, just a cluster of huts and houses tucked into the rolling hills of what might be 12th century Normandy, or the countryside near Prague, or the far reaches of a Scottish glen. Where you are doesn't matter so much, but who you are does. You are a woman. Not a noble woman, not a lady of court, not even a merchant's wife, just a regular person. Someone who wakes with the sun, someone who walks with sore feet. You have rough hands and an aching back. You know how to milk goats, and bake coarse bread, and fetch water without spilling it. And even in your small, quiet life, there are rules, strict ones. You might not be able to read them, because they're not always written down, but they're enforced all the same, by whispers, glances, by men in long robes, by neighbors, by priests, and sometimes even by other women who've learned the hard way that blending in is safer than standing out. So let's say, today, you talk a little too much. Maybe you mutter under your breath at the baker, who gave your daughter a smaller loaf than the blacksmith's boy. Maybe your voice carries a little too loudly when you tell your friend that the priest has been taking a few too many visits to a certain widow's home, and maybe someone overhears. Now, what you've done is not theft, it's not violence, it's not treason, but it's a kind of crime all the same, a scold's offense, a woman's crime of the mouth. Yes, that was a thing. In England, Scotland, and parts of Northern Europe, to be a scold meant you were a woman who talked too much, or too boldly, a woman whose voice was considered dangerous, not because it was threatening, but because it was disruptive. And disruption, in a world built on strict hierarchies, was the first step to collapse. There were punishments made just for this. The most infamous, the scold's bridle, also called the brank. It was a cruel and grotesque metal helmet that encased your entire head. It looked like a medieval torture device, because it was a metal frame clamped down over your skull, with a spiked or flattened plate pressed into your mouth, forcing your tongue still. You could breathe, but just barely. You could drool, you could weep, but you could not speak. And worse than that, they often paraded you through the town. People, even children, were encouraged to jeer, throw rotten vegetables, and shame you, because shame was the point. The idea wasn't just to punish the scold, it was to send a message to every other woman watching. Stay quiet, or this will be you. Sometimes they'd skip the bridle, and opt for something called the cucking stool, a kind of dunking chair mounted on a wooden beam over a river. You'd be strapped in and lowered, slowly, into the icy water again and again, until you were gasping and sobbing and shivering. It was said to cleanse the mouth, to tame the spirit, to wash away the crime of being loud. But this wasn't about hygiene, it was humiliation, plain and simple. Now, maybe you didn't gossip, maybe you were quiet, maybe you were even kind. That didn't always save you. Let's talk about idleness. Yes, just standing around. In many towns throughout Europe, a woman loitering in a public place, sitting alone on a bench, walking without a man, standing near the market with no money to spend, could be labeled suspicious. Suspicious behavior was often code for accusations of prostitution or petty theft. And for women, those lines blurred easily. The difference between poor widow looking for bread and woman of low morals could be as simple as whether or not your headscarf was torn, or how tired your eyes looked. Authorities would round up idle women for questioning. Some were fined, some were beaten, others were sentenced to branding, a hot iron pressed to the cheek or shoulder to mark them as criminals forever. The letters varied, a T for thief, an F for femme folle, mad woman, sometimes just a cross, to remind everyone that God had not forgotten your sins, even if you had. Then there were the sumptuary laws. Not many people talk about these, but they mattered, especially for women. In towns across England, France, Spain and Italy, there were entire books of laws written about clothing, who could wear what and when, and how. Velvet was for nobles only. Certain furs were reserved for clergy or court members. Silk, that was a luxury, few were allowed. Imagine being a washerwoman. You save up for weeks, and finally buy yourself a beautiful green dress, second hand, a little patched, but it makes you feel like someone. You wear it to the spring festival, but someone sees you, and they know the law. Green was a color of wealth, and you're not wealthy. You've now dressed above your station, which was a punishable offense. Authorities could fine you, or strip the dress from your back, in front of the entire market square. Some women were forced to wear special colors to mark their status afterward. A dull gray cloak, a badge sewn into the hem, a scarf that showed the world. This woman stepped out of line. In a world obsessed with order, even trying to look proud was a form of crime. Now, you might be wondering, what about love? Surely love wasn't a crime, right? Well, it depends on how you loved, and who you loved. In many regions, especially under church influence, extramarital affairs were deeply punished, but not always equally. If a married man slept with a woman outside his marriage, he might be fined, or ordered to give money to the church. But if you were that woman, even if the man was your employer, even if you had no choice, you could be flogged in public, forced to wear a shame mask shaped like a pig's snout or devil horns, or in some cases sent to live in isolation in a house of correction, a kind of proto-prison cloaked in piety. In Italy, women accused of promiscuity were sometimes marched barefoot through the streets. In Germany, they might be locked into a barrel, yes, a literal barrel, and rolled through the village as punishment. The deeper you look, the more you realize something chilling. These weren't crimes committed by women. These were punishments for simply being a woman in the wrong way. Too loud, too proud, too visible, too silent, too beautiful, too poor, too alone. It didn't matter how small your crime was. What mattered was that it challenged the fragile order of the world around you. A scolding tongue, a forbidden dress, a late-night walk, a smile given to the wrong man. These things could turn your world upside down, but we've only scratched the surface. What happens when a woman steals? Not words, not glances, but things. A piece of cloth, a string of coins, a loaf of bread for a starving child. Next we'll walk the line between survival and sin, and explore the desperate choices women made in a world with no safety nets, and the brutal cost of being caught. Rest easy for now. The darkest chapters are still to come, but for now, let the candle flicker low, and drift gently into the past, We've left behind the lightest whispers of crime, the offenses born not of wickedness but of noise, clothing, or a misplaced glance. And now we step into something heavier, still quiet, but full of weight, because this is where survival begins to cross paths with sin. Picture this, it's the early 1300s. The streets are slick with mud, the days are cold. Your husband, a farmhand, died last winter of a fever. Your 2 sons are old enough to beg, but not much more. The firewood is running low, the bread is gone, and the church alms. They've run out this week, again. You've asked, and the answer was a tight-lipped no. You are hungry, not just empty, not just uncomfortable, hollow, weak, desperate. And across the village square you see a basket of apples. It's sitting unattended outside the merchant's stall. No one is looking, so you take one, just one, for your child. But the merchant sees you, and suddenly, you're a thief. In today's world, it might seem like a slap on the wrist, a warning, a small fine, but in medieval Europe, theft was serious, regardless of the reason. And when the thief was a woman, the punishments could be crueler, harsher, because not only had you stolen, you had stepped out of your place. Again, you see men who stole might be whipped, branded, or put in stocks. But women were watched, judged harder, accused not just of stealing goods, but of stealing virtue, stealing decency, stealing order. In towns across England, France, and the Low Countries, petty theft could land you in public pillories, heavy wooden frames that clamped your hands and neck. You'd be left there, exposed to the cold, the rain, the stares, the ridicule of everyone you knew. People might throw things, old fruit, mud, spit. Your name would be whispered for months afterward. She's the one who took the apples. But that wasn't the worst outcome. Sometimes, women caught stealing, even small items, were branded. A hot iron, shaped like a letter, pressed to the skin, a T on the cheek, for thief, a V for vagabond. Sometimes, just a searing mark with no letter at all, just pain, a forever scar. And branding wasn't just punishment, it was identification.
If you were caught again.
No more questions, no more trials. You were already marked. You could be hanged for repeat offenses, or worse, banished. And in medieval times, banishment wasn't just moving to a new town, it meant being alone, with no land, no help, no rights. And for women, exile often meant death, or being forced into the only remaining form of trade, the one society used to condemn and profit from at the same time, prostitution. Now, let's pause here, because this part of the story of women who use their bodies to survive, it's not simple, it's not pretty, and it's not always what people think. In medieval Europe, sex work was technically condemned by the church, but tolerated by towns, cities, and lords, as long as it remained in its proper place. That place, usually the outskirts, the alley behind the tavern, the windows of the red light districts. Yes, those existed even then. In places like Paris, London, Ghent, and Prague, there were entire neighborhoods designated for women of the night, sometimes called women of the stews, named after bathhouses where sex work often occurred. These women were not all criminals by nature. Many were widows, abandoned, exiled, desperate. For some, this was the only choice left after being cast out for a prior crime, theft, scandal, adultery, or simply being too poor. But once you entered that world, there was rarely a way back. Laws changed around you. In France, brothel workers were required to wear certain colors, often yellow, to mark them as unclean. In England, they were taxed, watched, sometimes arrested on vague charges like disturbance of the peace. In Spain, some cities forced them to live in locked quarters at night, guarded like livestock. And while men who visited brothels were rarely punished, the women inside could be whipped, shaved, branded, or worse if accused of stepping out of line. One slip of the tongue, one argument with a customer, one false accusation, you could be dragged into the center of town and flogged. Some were tied to carts and paraded naked. Some were chained to whipping posts in public squares. Even if you had committed no other crime, just being a woman in that line of work meant you were permanently criminal. Now some women tried to find another way out, a way back to respectability. Maybe they would marry, join a convent, flee to another village and change their name. But the records followed them, or the whispers did, or the marks on their skin. And those who were caught a second time, maybe for stealing again, maybe for being found in the wrong company, were punished as repeat offenders. And repeat offenders didn't always get a second sentence. They got the gallows. Even for women, there are cases from Flanders, in what is now Belgium, of women being hanged for the second offense of bread theft, not because of what was stolen, but because they had broken trust, a second betrayal. The law, it seemed, could forgive hunger once, but not twice. And here's a painful truth. Many women didn't steal for themselves, they stole for their children. There are heartbreaking records from the court rolls of 14th century London, Florence and Crackle of women caught with a heel of bread, a pair of shoes or a roll of cloth, and when questioned they said plainly, "For my baby, for warmth, because we have none." The courts didn't always care. Sometimes leniency was shown, a reduced sentence, a few days in the stocks instead of lashes, a warning instead of exile. But more often, punishment was swift and public, because women were expected to endure poverty with grace, to suffer quietly, to wait for alms, to beg. But the moment they took what wasn't given, they were no longer seen as mothers or victims, they were seen as criminals. So they became clever, fast. Women would hide items under their skirts, sewn into the folds. Children were trained to distract shopkeepers, while their mothers took what they needed. There were even groups, loose networks of poor women, who helped each other survive. One would shop, another would scout, a third would take the risk. The goods would be shared. They weren't organized crime families. They were desperate women trying to avoid starvation. But if they were caught, conspiracy, collusion, gang theft, and the punishments got worse: prison, whipping, branding, or execution. Let's pause again. Imagine this was you, not because you were cruel or greedy, but because you were hungry. You'd asked for help, you'd waited for your turn, but it never came. So you reached out trembling and took something small. And that was all it took. You were marked, watched, judged, condemned, your name etched in a ledger, your face remembered. And the terrifying part, you weren't alone. There were thousands like you, across Italy, Germany, Spain, the Baltics, Scandinavia, all trying to survive under systems not built for them, systems that punished desperation, that criminalized hunger, that silenced women for trying to live. And that's what this chapter was really about. Not just about theft, not just punishment, but about the widening space between being poor and being labeled criminal. And for women that space was very, very small. As we continue, we'll enter even darker territory, because not every woman committed a crime out of necessity. Some committed acts that were, by medieval standards, unforgivable: adultery, infanticide, poisoning, witchcraft. And the justice for these women, it was brutal, often fatal, and deeply public. But before we go there, take a moment, rest, let your mind wander back to those muddy streets, that stolen apple, that quiet desperation. Let yourself feel it, not as judgment, but as understanding. In medieval Europe, there were many kinds of crimes, but some weren't really crimes at all, at least not by modern standards. They were simply choices, or moments of weakness, or accidents of the heart. And yet for a woman, those moments could bring down a lifetime of punishment. Let's talk about adultery. We'll call it that, though in medieval terms the word meant more than just a forbidden relationship. It meant betrayal, sin, a challenge to the structure of the household, of the church, of God himself. For a man, straying outside of marriage was considered improper, sometimes even sinful, but it was often forgiven, especially if the man was wealthy, powerful, or well-liked. For a woman, it could be deadly. The rules were strict. In England, under common law; in Italy, under canon law; and across the German states, under a tangled web of civic and ecclesiastical codes. A woman accused of betraying her marriage vows could be tried, punished, and publicly shamed. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that you are that woman. Maybe your husband is away, a soldier, a merchant, a drunk, a man who stopped being kind a long time ago. You're left alone for months, maybe even years, and you grow close to someone else, a friend, a companion, someone who listens, someone who makes you feel human again. But in a small town, nothing is secret for long. One neighbor sees a glance, another sees someone leaving your cottage at dusk. Whispers start to spread. You try to ignore them, to carry on, but soon the whispers become questions. The questions become accusations, and one morning, you're summoned. Depending on where you live, this could mean standing before a manorial court, a church tribunal, or even your local lord's audience chamber. And the question is simple: did you violate your marriage vows? And there is no safe answer. If you say yes, you've just condemned yourself. If you say no, and they don't believe you, they may punish you anyway. In many parts of Europe, a confession could result in penance. This meant standing barefoot at the church doors on Sunday morning, holding a candle, asking the congregation for forgiveness. It meant fasting, chanting, months of silence and isolation. But if the court deemed your crime more severe, or if the town was angry, or if your family was disgraced, then the punishment could be physical. Some were beaten, others were branded, some were even shaved bald as a mark of shame, their hair, considered a sign of beauty, taken from them. There are chilling records from Florence, Lubeck, and southern France, describing women marched through the streets in coarse robes, their heads bowed, guards on either side, while townsfolk jeered and pointed. In some parts of Germany and Poland, the punishment was exile, banished from the town for dishonoring the community. And this was for the crime of the heart, or even just the suspicion of it, because as strange as it sounds, a woman could be punished even without proof. A child born outside of marriage, proof enough. An anonymous letter accusing you could be enough. Even your silence in court, if you refused to answer, could be taken as an admission. Now, let's speak gently, of those children. Children born from illicit unions, as the records often call them, were labeled illegitimate. And that word meant everything in medieval society. Illegitimate children could not inherit land. They were not accepted into noble bloodlines. They were often shunned, denied apprenticeship, refused positions in the church, not because they had done anything wrong, but because of how and where they came into the world. And their mothers, they bore the brunt of the blame. A single woman who gave birth was often accused of immorality. She might be punished by the church, forced to wear a sign or badge that marked her shame. Some towns had rules that these women could not walk near the marketplace or attend certain festivals. In places like Spain and Hungary, these women were sometimes forced to perform public repentance, standing outside their homes with ashes on their heads, not once, but for weeks. And again, it didn't matter how it happened. It didn't matter if the woman had been pressured, or taken advantage of, or simply alone and afraid. The system did not ask. It only punished. And for women who had no family, no husband, no protector, the risk was even greater, because in some cases, the shame was too much to bear. There are tragic records of women abandoning their children in secret, hoping someone would find them, hoping they'd survive, hoping to escape the punishment that hovered over their heads like a blade. But if the child died, or if someone saw her, she could be tried for infanticide. And this was one of the worst crimes a woman could be accused of in the medieval world. Even if the death was unintentional, a stillbirth, a miscarriage, a child lost to illness, the suspicion alone could bring a sentence of death. In England, women were sometimes pressed with stones. In France, they were hanged. In Eastern Europe, burned. Many of these cases were based on hearsay, rumors, no proof, just fear, and the need to make an example. Even worse, some towns began requiring midwives to report any births that seemed suspicious. Midwives became unwilling agents of surveillance, and women gave birth in secret, terrified of what might follow. Now, this all sounds grim, and it was. But within these stories, you'll also find quiet forms of resistance. Women who protected each other, who lied to the courts to shield a friend, who whispered advice to younger girls, guiding them through the dangerous waters of love and judgment. There were convents that took in unmarried mothers, healers who knew ways to help without leaving scars, neighbors who covered for each other, even when it cost them. Because deep down, even in the harshest places, there were always people who understood that love is not a crime, that survival is not sin, that a woman's story cannot be judged by a single moment. So as you lie here now, maybe with your eyes closed, drifting off, let your thoughts settle, let the stories soften in your mind, let the echo of those unjust punishments fade into stillness. And next we will step into a world that terrified nearly every woman in medieval Europe. Accusations of witchcraft, no longer the quiet shame of the heart, but the loud, terrifying scream of mass fear. Women who healed, who spoke too freely, who didn't conform, they became targets. Their punishments were darker, more violent, and often final. And you're still here, still listening, still resting, still tucked into a story that stretches back through time like the roots of an old forgotten tree. Tonight, we drift even deeper, into the realm of shadows and suspicion, into the part of history where fear wrapped itself around the lives of women like a dark cloak, and where the line between criminal and cursed became terrifyingly thin. This is the story of witchcraft. But let's be clear from the beginning. Most of the women accused of being witches were not performing dark rituals. They weren't casting spells or making pacts with sinister forces. They were doing something far more dangerous. They were surviving. They were women who healed the sick with herbs, who knew which plants could calm a fever or ease a difficult childbirth. They were widows who lived alone, midwives who whispered ancient prayers, old women with cloudy eyes who muttered warnings as they passed you on the road. And in a time when religion ruled and science was still locked behind monastery walls, that kind of knowledge was feared. It wasn't always this way. In the early medieval centuries, before the year 1000, accusations of witchcraft were rare, healing was accepted, folk remedies were passed down, villages depended on their wise women, their herbalists, their spiritual guides. But as the centuries passed, things began to change. The church grew more powerful, more centralized. more wary of anything it could not control. And by the 13th and 14th centuries, whispers of heresy began to evolve into accusations of something darker. Let's imagine for a moment that you are such a woman. You live in a quiet hamlet in the hills of what is now Bavaria. Your hands are stained green from collecting herbs. You learned from your mother, who learned from hers. People come to you with coughs, aches, childbirth pains, sleeplessness, and you help, quietly, freely, with kindness. But one winter, a child you tended to does not survive. You had done your best, poultices, teas, prayers, but nature chose otherwise. And now the mother, blinded by grief, looks to you and asks, what did you give her? Then she asks, what did you do? Then someone says, she never goes to church. And someone else says, she talks to birds. And then the word is spoken, witch. It doesn't matter how much good you've done. That word changes everything. Suddenly you are no longer just a healer. You are suspicious. You are unnatural. You are someone who knows too much. And in the eyes of the church, that was the first step toward evil. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in Germany, France, Switzerland and the Low Countries, the late Middle Ages saw the slow rise of witch trials. They started small, a few arrests, a few confessions, a few flames. But then came the manuals. In the mid-1400s, a book was published, a dark book, a book that would change the lives of countless women. It was called Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, and it claimed that women, particularly older women, poor women, midwives and healers, were more prone to temptation, that they were spiritually weaker, and therefore more likely to fall into the hands of evil. This wasn't just folklore anymore, it was policy, and across towns and villages, witch hunters emerged. They asked questions designed to trap. They sought out marks on the skin, moles, birthmarks, claiming these were signs of the devil. They tested women by throwing them into rivers, watching to see if they floated, and if they did, guilty, and if they sank, innocent, but often drowned. Imagine the terror, not of being accused, but of knowing that nothing you said could protect you. Deny it. That was what a witch would do. Confess. Well, now you'd given them what they wanted. Women were tortured, not always with fire or whips, sometimes with silence, with isolation, with weeks of sleep deprivation, with threats to their children, with lies whispered through the bars of a cell. And in that lonely candlelit darkness, even the innocent could begin to doubt themselves. Some confessed to things they had never done, just to make it stop. Some tried to name others, hoping to lessen their sentence. And some stayed silent to the end. In Germany alone, it's estimated that tens of thousands of women were accused during the height of the witch trials. In parts of Switzerland, entire villages saw half their female population imprisoned or executed. In Scotland, the trials became so numerous that they had to build new jails, just to hold the accused. And what were these women's real crimes? A knowledge of plants, a sharp tongue, a neighbor who envied them, a cat that followed them home, a body that aged, a mind that wandered, a life lived alone. That was all it took. Now, some towns resisted. Some priests and bishops spoke out, arguing that witchcraft was a myth, a fantasy born from fear. But those voices were drowned out by the roar of panic and the crackle of flames. Women weren't the only ones accused, but they made up the overwhelming majority. And the reasons, when you look closely, all point back to control. Women who stood outside the system, who didn't marry, didn't obey, didn't conform, were dangerous, not because they hurt anyone, but because they existed on their own terms. And the world of the medieval village wasn't ready for that. So what happened to those who survived? Some escaped into the woods, into exile, into lives of secrecy and silence. Others returned home, changed, broken, forgotten. A few rebuilt their lives, with scars hidden beneath their sleeves, and stories never told aloud again. And today, their names are mostly gone, carved into weather-worn stones, buried in forgotten ledgers, or whispered in legends as the old witch, the crone, the herbalist, who vanished. But their stories, they remain, quietly, waiting to be heard. So as you lie here now, breathing softly, listening to the wind of centuries, know this: these women were not monsters, they were not criminals, they were human, complicated, caring, clever, and in many ways far ahead of their time. Our journey continues next, into the world of punishment, without justice. When accusation itself became the sentence, when torture became a method of truth, and when prisons were filled not with the guilty, but with the unwanted. Now we're stepping into a place colder than any dungeon, darker than any superstition, a place where pain became policy, and justice was not about truth, but about submission. In the world of medieval Europe, there was a belief, powerful, dangerous, and tragically persistent, that truth could be extracted through suffering. And for women accused of crime, especially those accused of offenses that left little physical evidence, like witchcraft, heresy, betrayal, or even adultery, this belief turned the entire justice system into something terrifyingly personal. Because once you were accused, once you were named, your fate was no longer about innocence or guilt, it was about how long you could hold on. Let's set the scene. You're a woman of about 40, you've lived a quiet life, you know the rhythms of the seasons better than the names of kings. One morning, without warning, you're taken from your cottage. You don't know why, no one tells you. The neighbors avoid your eyes, they say nothing. You're brought into a stone building, the windows are too small to let in light. You're left alone for hours, maybe longer. You don't know if it's morning or night. And finally, someone speaks. They tell you that you've been accused. Maybe it was a lie, someone told in anger. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe you spoke out of turn, and the wrong person heard you. Or maybe no one accused you at all, but the constable needed someone to blame. Either way, here you are. And this is the beginning of what they call an inquiry. Now let's pause. In modern justice systems, we're familiar with the idea that a person is innocent until proven guilty. But in medieval Europe, often the reverse was true. Accusation alone could justify detainment, and detainment could justify interrogation, and interrogation could involve torture. Now we won't describe anything harsh here. That's not what this space is for. But you need to know how easily things spiraled, how little was needed to justify pain, because pain was a shortcut. In the eyes of certain inquisitors, judges, and local officials, it was a way to speed up justice. And for women, especially those who were poor, unmarried, or already seen as suspicious, that shortcut was used more often. There were rules, of course, laws, limits, documents that said torture should only be used under specific conditions, but those rules were easily bent, because all someone had to say was, "She fits the profile. She was seen with the accused. She didn't weep when her neighbor died. She doesn't attend mass. She speaks to herself." That was enough. And once you were in the chamber, you were in the hands of men who believed, truly believed, that truth lived inside your silence, and pain was the key to unlocking it. You might be shown the tools, just shown, not touched. This alone was a form of coercion called preparatory examination. Iron cuffs, weights, the rack, the pair, all laid out like kitchen instruments. You'd be told what each one did. You'd be asked your name again, then asked about your sins, then reminded, gently, that confession meant mercy. And if you refused, the pressure increased. Sleep deprivation was common. You might be kept awake for days, never struck, never touched, but left in discomfort, exposed to the cold, with loud chanting, or chains rattling nearby. No wounds, no scars, but inside, you'd begin to unravel. Eventually, you might say anything just to make it stop. And that was the goal, because confession in the medieval system wasn't just evidence, it was the crown jewel of proof. A confession meant the court could say, "We did not punish an innocent. She said it herself." Even if it wasn't true, even if the words were whispered in fear, even if the phrases were prompted, repeated, or misunderstood. And remember, the people taking these confessions weren't always cruel. Some were just men doing their jobs, convinced they were saving your soul. They believed confession was for your own good, that it cleansed you, that it gave you a path to repentance. They believed, sometimes, that pain was mercy, but it wasn't mercy for the women who endured it. It was isolation, it was hopelessness, it was the sound of your own voice, saying things you never did, because silence had become too heavy to carry. Now not all women were subjected to this. Many were spared the chamber. They were fined, banished, imprisoned, or paraded publicly, heads shaved, clothes torn, signs hung around their necks reading liar, citrus or worse. But those who were brought to confession chambers often never returned the same, and not just physically, because what's not often talked about, what the books don't always record, is what came after the sentence, after the flogging, after the burning, after the release. There were women who confessed to things they had never done, and then had to live the rest of their lives, knowing that their names had become warnings. Others were never believed, no matter what they said. One widow in 15th century Strasbourg was accused of poisoning her neighbor's cow. She denied it. The court didn't believe her. She was pressed for days, until finally exhausted, she confessed. Her sentence was exile, but when she reached the next town, they had already heard the story. She was turned away, and again, and again. Eventually, she wandered into the forest, and no one saw her again. Another woman, a midwife in Lombardy, was accused of misusing her knowledge of childbirth. They said too many babies in her village had died. She was taken, questioned, shown the iron, and confessed to improper prayer. Her punishment, public humiliation, 3 years in prison, and permanent banishment from her trade. She never delivered another child. These women weren't monsters. They weren't even truly criminals. They were just people, caught in a system that didn't know how to see them. And the system itself, it was made up of men who often had no formal legal training. Local lords, parish priests, inquisitors, with more zeal than understanding. Torture wasn't used in every case, but its shadow hovered over every accusation, because the message was clear: if you do not comply, we will find a way to make you. So how did it end? Eventually, by the 17th century, use of forced confessions began to decline. Philosophers questioned it. Courts revised their procedures. Some countries outright banned the use of torture. But for hundreds of years before that, thousands of women had already paid the price. And the saddest part, we don't know most of their names. They're scattered through dusty scrolls, lost in parish records, briefly mentioned in faded margins, often labeled not by who they were, but by what they were accused of. Mary, widow, confessed under duress. Elena, healer, punished for falsehood. Agnes, daughter of no one, vanished following inquiry. But tonight, we remember them differently. Not as victims, not as criminals, but as women who lived in a world built against them, and who endured anyway. Let yourself rest now. Let the silence settle. Let the darkness of that world fade, replaced by warmth and safety. Because in our next chapter, we'll travel into a different kind of injustice. One found in prisons, madhouses, and asylums, where women were locked away not because they stole, or harmed, or even confessed, but because they were simply inconvenient. Now let's talk about the hidden cells, imprisonment, silence, and the women who were locked away places with no titles or plaques, no noble causes, just walls, doors, silence. This chapter is not about crimes that were committed, it's about how women were removed from homes, from families, from streets, from life, not for stealing, not for harming, not even for speaking too loudly, though that could still get you in trouble, but for being inconvenient. Let me show you what I mean. You're a young woman in 14th century England. You're 21, maybe a little headstrong. You speak your mind more than most. You question things, like why the tithes are so high, or why your brother inherited the farm and not you. Maybe you've said something unkind about the priest, or your husband, who hits you when he drinks too much. Maybe you've run away and come back. Maybe you haven't married yet at all. Your family says they love you, but one morning, they take you by the arm and lead you to a gatehouse just outside of town. You don't understand why, until you see the door, iron-bound, with a slot for bread and a hole for waste. You're not being taken to court, you're not being charged, you're being put away, because you've been labeled something deeply feared in the medieval world, a nuisance. You've been disturbing the peace, resisting your role, bringing shame, and so they remove you. In many towns across medieval Europe, especially in England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, there existed buildings that weren't quite jails, not quite hospitals, and certainly not homes. Places known as houses of correction, asylums, confinement chambers, or simply, the cells. Their purpose, to detain the unwanted. Unwanted didn't always mean criminal. It often meant uncontrollable, unmarriageable, too loud, too defiant, mentally ill, too sad, too proud. Sometimes all it took was the word of a father, a brother, a husband, a bishop. She's acting strangely, she's possessed, she's not herself, and without a trial, without a sentence, the door would close behind her. Inside, the life was simple: a wooden cot, a rough wool blanket, a bowl, a small window, if you were lucky, You might see another woman across the room, silent, swaying, eyes glassy. You might not speak for days. You might be fed once a day, or not. You might be told to pray. You might be punished for refusing. But you wouldn't see the outside again until someone decided you were cured, and cured had no definition. Some women remained inside for months, others for years, some forever. Let's pause for a moment here, because this wasn't always about cruelty. Sometimes it was fear, confusion, desperation. Mental illness wasn't understood in the medieval period. Women who suffered from deep grief, hallucinations, trauma, or emotional distress were often described as mad, touched, or hysterical. The word hysteria itself comes from the Greek, for uterus, because many believed a woman's womb was the source of her irrationality. So if a woman cried too often, or stopped speaking, or screamed when touched, or wandered at night, they were locked away, for their own safety, some said. But there were no doctors in these places, no therapists, no comfort, just stone walls, and time. In Paris, there were hospices, old convents turned into holding places for women who didn't fit. In Italy, small rooms were built beside churches for quiet confinement. In parts of Germany, towers called spinsters' halls were repurposed to hold women who lived too differently from the norm. And once you were inside, your voice didn't matter. Records show that many of these women were never recorded by name, only by number, or by role. Wife of a drunk, daughter of a heretic, sister of the thief, silent one, shrieker, Mary, age unknown. Some did make it out, if a family member returned for them, if a new priest interceded, if the town no longer cared. But even then, the world outside had changed, and so had they. Years spent in silence, or shame, or fear. What do you say when you come back from that? Who are you, when the world has already decided you are broken? Some women tried to rebuild, to marry, to move to a new village, to pretend it never happened. Others simply disappeared, and others, many others, were taken from those cells, directly to places of penal labor. Because in later medieval years, especially in cities, these inconvenient women became a workforce. They were sent to workhouses, where they spun thread, laundered cloth, scrubbed stone, cleaned wounds, or washed corpses, in return for bread, water, and one corner of floor to sleep on. No wage, no freedom, no choice. They weren't considered criminals, but they weren't free women either. They were shadows, between guilt and innocence, held not because of what they did, but because they no longer fit anywhere else. And so, they were forgotten. Which brings us here, to you, to me, to this quiet moment in the dark. Remember this: the history of criminal women in the medieval world is not always about the actions they took, but about the world they lived in. A world where being poor, or loud, or too different, could be all it took to have your name erased. But tonight, we remember, we speak softly of them, we hold space, we listen, because their stories were silenced once, but not anymore. So rest, now, let the stories settle, let the shadows stay behind the walls where they belong. And in our next chapter, we'll meet the women who fought back, who refused to go quietly, who challenged the courts, escaped the chains, defied their judges, outlaws, rebels, disguised women, smugglers, poisoners, escapers of prisons. Up to now, we've met women who were accused, punished, silenced, often for doing nothing at all. But not all women accepted the roles they were given. Some ran, some resisted, and some disappeared into the margins of history, leaving only a trail of whispers and questions behind them. This chapter is for them, the women who refused to vanish. Let's begin with a simple idea. In a world where rules were everything, breaking the rules was dangerous, but it was also sometimes necessary, especially for survival. Imagine you're a woman in 14th century Flanders. You've been sentenced to flogging for selling goods without a license, something men were often fined for. But you, being a woman without permission, were punished more harshly. You've seen what happens in the square: the whip, the crowd, the shame. And so, the night before the sentence is to be carried out, you do something unexpected. You run. You leave behind your home, your name, your belongings. You take only what you can carry: a cloak, a little food, and a small knife for protection. You walk for days, following the river, sleeping in barns or under trees. Eventually you reach a new town, one where no one knows your name. And just like that, you become someone else. In records from Bruges, Ghent, and Cologne, there are dozens of cases where women accused of petty crime simply vanished before sentencing and were never found again, not because they died, but because they reinvented themselves. Some dressed as men and joined traveling merchant caravans, or took work as laborers. Others lived under false names, working as tavern assistants, seamstresses, or kitchen maids. There's even a case in 15th century Vienna of a woman who was accused of theft, fled the city disguised in a wool cloak and hood, and was later discovered masquerading as a novice monk. By the time she was caught, she had lived among men for 3 years, attending prayers, cutting her hair, and sleeping on a stone floor, all to escape a sentence that would have seen her flogged and branded. And she wasn't alone. Throughout medieval Europe, from the Scottish Highlands to the streets of Seville, women fled injustice by becoming someone, or something, else. Some became outlaws in the woods, not bandits in the romantic sense, but people simply trying to survive off the land, hiding from those who had once called them family or neighbor. In England's Sherwood Forest, yes, the very one made famous by tales of Robin Hood, there are records of wild women living among poachers and smugglers. They were fugitives, not saints, not villains, just people who had chosen exile over disgrace. Some joined traveling theater troupes, where roles and names were fluid, where women could pretend to be men on stage, and in life, others vanished into ports, boarding ships as kitchen hands, hiding below deck, until they reached a place where their past could no longer follow. Let's stop here for a moment, and think, what kind of strength does it take to do that? To leave behind everything you've known, even your identity, just to escape a punishment you didn't deserve. There's bravery in that, but also sorrow, because these women weren't just escaping the law, they were escaping a world that didn't make space for them. Now, not all resistors ran, some stayed, and fought back. In northern France, one court record from 1382 describes a woman accused of sedition, stirring unrest in the town by accusing the local magistrate of corruption. She was dragged before the court, told to recant. She refused. She stood in court and said plainly, "I have told no lies." The clerk wrote that she was unapologetic, composed and proud. Her punishment, a year in a cell, but after she was released, she left the town, and was later reported founding a female-run guild in another city, a quiet act of rebellion, a life rebuilt on her terms. Then there were the informal networks, women helping women escape, a maid slipping food through the prison window, a washerwoman who passed along a false name, a midwife who falsified a record. They weren't part of an organization, they had no banner, but they were rebels, in the oldest and quietest way, through kindness. Now, what happened to these runaways? Some were caught, and when they were, the punishments could be severe, longer sentences, exile, even death. But many were never caught. They became mothers, merchants, nuns, travelers, midwives. Some may have told their stories to daughters, years later, in candlelit rooms, with the door locked tight. And maybe, just maybe, some of those daughters told their daughters. And now tonight, you're hearing echoes of them too, because resistance, in the medieval world, wasn't always a sword or a banner. Sometimes it was just a woman, running through the woods, trying to make her own way, a girl refusing to marry, a widow refusing to repent, a servant who slipped out in the night, and never returned. Their names are mostly gone, but their choices left footprints. So let's pause here, just for a moment. You are safe, you are warm, you are not running, you are not locked away, you're simply listening, resting, remembering, and when you're ready, I'll take you into our next chapter, where we'll explore the final piece of this journey, the forgotten dead, execution, burial, and how history tried to erase them. We've spoken of silence, of punishment, of resistance, but now, we speak of what came last, of endings, of women who never escaped their sentences, who did not run, who did not survive. This is about the forgotten dead. Let's take it slow. Close your eyes if you haven't already, or soften your gaze. We're going to walk together, gently, quietly, through the final pages of many lives. Not to scare you, not to haunt you, but to remember them, because someone should. It begins with a sentence. Maybe it was for a second theft. Maybe it was for a confession made under pain. Maybe it was a lie told by a neighbor. Maybe it was just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Whatever it was, the punishment was final. In much of medieval Europe, from the snowy plains of Scandinavia to the markets of Italy, execution was not reserved for warlords or traitors alone. Women too were condemned, and the crimes, often heartbreakingly small. Let's start with hanging. In England and Scotland, this was the most common method of execution for women convicted of repeat crimes: theft, poisoning, or aiding in an escape. It was public, always public. The scaffold was built in the square, a rope slung over a beam. A crowd gathered, not out of hatred, always, but out of curiosity. Execution was a kind of theatre, a warning. The woman would be led forward, sometimes barefoot, sometimes in a plain shift. If she confessed, she might be allowed to speak. Some used those final words to ask forgiveness. Others shouted their innocence. Some said nothing at all. Then it ended, and the crowd dispersed, and the rope came down, and the name was rarely spoken again. Then there were burnings, more rare but deeply symbolic. In France, Germany, and some regions of Central Europe, women accused of sorcery or heresy were sometimes sentenced to death by fire. It wasn't always the image conjured in modern stories. There were rituals, formalities. Sometimes they were offered a chance to repent, to say the right words and be spared the flame, though death would still come. Other times, it was swift. Fire, in medieval justice, meant purification. To burn a woman was to cleanse the community. It was cruel, it was final, and it was public. But sometimes, the executions were quiet. Some women were drowned, weighted and lowered into rivers, especially in parts of Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. Others were buried alive, a form of execution usually reserved for extreme cases of infanticide or betrayal. But the most common ending was not just death, it was erasure. After execution, many of these women were denied proper burial. In a Christian world, being buried in consecrated ground, in a churchyard, under the care of priests, was believed to be essential for peace in the afterlife. But criminals, outcasts, those accused of moral sin, they were buried elsewhere, outside the walls, beyond the fields, in ditches, in unmarked graves. Sometimes, they weren't buried at all, just left shrouded, weighted down. No ceremony, no name carved in stone, no prayers. There are records of potters' fields, burial sites for the poor, the accused, the unknown, on the edges of cities like London, Paris, Prague and Krakow, and in those fields were countless women. No markers, no visitors, no record. Even their names, written once in trial ledgers or scribbled in church margins, faded with time. But they lived, they breathed, they laughed, they tried, they failed, and still, they mattered. Why were they forgotten? Part of it was shame. Families did not speak of the daughter who died on the scaffold. The two communities pretended it hadn't happened. The scribes moved on to the next case. The priests said their prayers, and kept quiet. But part of it was design. A woman punished publicly was meant to be a lesson. But a woman remembered, that was dangerous. Because to remember her was to question why she died, to question the system, to wonder if she was ever truly guilty. And that couldn't be allowed, so she was erased. But not completely, because tonight, here, now, in your quiet room, in the middle of the night, you're thinking of her. You're remembering the unnamed, the unjustly punished, the wrongly accused, the ones who ran, the ones who stayed, the ones who confessed, the ones who whispered, "I did nothing." And that remembering, it matters, because it means their stories weren't lost. They were simply waiting for someone to listen. So now, rest. You've walked a long path, through chambers, key courts, woods, cells, graves. You've heard the silence. You've seen the fire. You've met women who history tried to forget, but they are still here, in the stories, in the echoes, in the quiet spaces between pages. Let them rest. And you too. We'll bring everything together in our final chapter, a soft reflection on what it means to be seen, remembered, and human. And now, we've reached the end, not of the night, not of the silence, but of the story we've been telling together, softly, carefully, patiently, from the moment you closed your eyes. You've followed me through darkened alleys, whispered courtrooms, muddy fields, wooden cells. You've met women who were punished for speaking too freely, for dressing too well, for loving wrongly, for stealing bread, for trying to heal, for running. Women who were locked away, branded, exiled. Women who were tortured until they said what the world wanted to hear. Women who lived quiet, careful lives, and were punished anyway. Women who, in truth, committed no crime at all. And now that we're here, at the edge of this long night, I want to tell you something. These stories matter, even though they're old, even though the names are faded, and the records are hard to read, even though they took place in times that feel so far from us now, under candlelight, behind monastery walls, beside village wells. They still matter, because behind every case, every accusation, every punishment, every forgotten grave, was a real person. She might have been someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother, or no one's at all. Just a woman trying to live a small, ordinary life, and getting caught in something much bigger than her. And by listening, by remembering, by saying their stories aloud, even in a whisper, even in the quiet of your own room, you undo just a little of the forgetting. And that is powerful, because for centuries, these women weren't given the last word. Their stories were interrupted, ended, buried. But tonight, they were told, start to finish, not as courtroom footnotes, not as villains, not even as martyrs, but as human beings, complex, clever, frightened, strong, sometimes silent, sometimes screaming, always real. And now, we leave them to rest. We close the final page. We step away from the scaffold, the bridle, the gatehouse, the dungeon. We let the fires go cold, we let the voices soften, and we breathe. Because your story, your night, your rest, continues. And theirs, well, it doesn't end with punishment anymore. It ends with remembrance. So now, sleep. Let your breath slow. Let your body sink into the stillness. You've traveled far tonight, through centuries, through silence, through sorrow, and now, through peace. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this slow journey through forgotten history, you're welcome to subscribe. Leave a quiet comment if you'd like. Maybe tell us where you're listening from, or what time it is where you are. But for now, let the story fade, let the room grow quiet, and let the night hold you. You are safe, you are resting, and somewhere, someone who history forgot, is remembered. Good night.